Welcome, and this is our review for Chapter 9 on digestive system and quick review of nutrition. So let's take a look at what comprises our digestive system, and then we'll break it down into the different components, and then finally some important notes related to nutrition. To begin, we want to understand what are the steps, the chronological events that happen in the digestive process. So of course, you have to first take the food in. So the word ingestion is actually to bring the food in, but not to actually break it down into pieces that can be absorbed. When we talk about digestion, we're looking at mechanically and chemically breaking down food into what we're going to call subunits. So this is both mechanical and chemical breaking down, because these subunits have to be formed for us to actually pull it across our intestinal tract and begin to use the nutrients and the minerals and so on that we need. So the movement step, of course, occurs from the mouth all the way to the end of the digestive tract, the rectum and the anus. And the movement of this food along what we're calling GI tract, that's gastrointestinal tract, is going to fulfill all these other functions of your digestive system. The function of absorption is to actually, like a sponge, take the nutrients across the GI tract, right? So if they do not come across the GI tract, they never really become part of us. They're in this passageway and really not part of our body, and we're not utilizing the nutrients. And then finally, of course, those things that we don't need, much of which is indigestible, those molecules will be eliminated at the end of the tract. This is a figure that helps you visualize some of those main really events or purposes of the GI tract. So of course, to ingest through the mouth. So the mouth is designed for food ingestion. When we talk about mechanical and chemical digestion, of course, mechanical digestion begins in the mouth, but it's going to continue in the stomach and the small intestine, all these areas. As the food is pushed through, it's going to be squeezed and pushed, and that is a type of mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion, of course, has to occur for us to take the material into our bloodstream, and that's what's shown over here, as we see these arrows demonstrating the movement of our nutrients into our bloodstream, and that's the process of absorption. There's a word, propulsion, which describes really how we take the food from point A to point B in a very specific direction. In addition, we're going to add this word peristalsis later on that helps the movement again to be unidirectional. And of course, to eliminate through the process of defecation for the digestive tract. If this was, of course, urinary system, we'd be talking about excretion through the urinary system. Here's a picture of lining, just a generic look at the GI tract lining, and to remind you that, in fact, there are muscle layers that are part of this tract. So they will squeeze and push. We'll also have these things called villi that will help absorb the materials. So it's designed for the specific function of digestion and absorption. As we take a quick glance at the digestive system in this overview, you can see not only is the tract where this food moves and across which we absorb the nutrients, which of course would be as we go the back of the mouth here, the pharynx, the esophagus, the tube leading to the stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine, and then finally at the end, the rectum and anus. That is the actual pathway, or what we call the GI tract. So then you'll have additional digestive organs that are supplementary, or what we call accessory organs. So you've got, of course, salivary glands that help with the moisture and the enzymes that begin digestion, liver, a huge metabolic organ, helping to process what we take in, what we absorb. Pancreas, very, very essential for hormone regulation of digestion, but also with many enzymes and buffers. So these are all part of your digestive system overview. What is helpful is that you can be able to put these words in order. In fact, not even see the words, but be able to say, all right, food will what? Enter the mouth first. Where does the mouth then push the food? When we initiate swallowing, it goes to the back of the mouth and then downward. We're going to call that area the pharynx, which then goes to the esophagus, muscular tube, pushing the food to the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped organ, and that is going to begin digestion of proteins in particular. And that stomach then will push the food onto the small intestine, which goes on to the large intestine. And then, of course, toward the end, the rectum, which is associated with the final ending, the two openings, mouth and then anus. So what we'll do is look very briefly at the upper part of the digestive tract and the roles that these areas play in digestion. When you think about the crucial role of the opening for food, which is the mouth, we normally don't think of food coming through your nose. So in the mouth, you have these supplementary or accessory glands known as salivary glands. In particular, there's going to be an enzyme released here called salivary amylase, and that begins carbohydrate digestion. All right, so in particular, it's going to digest starch. So you may want to add that in your notes that we're seeing the digestion specifically of starch by this enzyme known as amylase. And so when starch breaks down, one example you can think of knowing that this is happening is if you have put a cracker in your mouth, a pretzel, something with a lot of complex carbohydrate, that starch will break down and it will begin to taste sweet. Not that you want to leave the cracker in your mouth for very long, but that sweet flavor says that amylase has been working, and now there are smaller, what we call sugar molecules that are present in your mouth. Of course, tonsils are really not part of the digestive system, but when we think of tonsils, which are lymphatic, immune system organs, you think of those as being something you can see when you open your mouth. We'll look at that in a few minutes, but it's really part of your immune function in a lymphatic tissue. And then, of course, your teeth are present to help with mechanical digestion. The tongue moves the food around. That's also helping with mechanical breakdown of the food. And one description of food as it moves through our system is this description of a bolus. That just means a mass of chewed food, and that's what moves towards your pharynx and then down your esophagus. Here's a picture of a mouth where you can clearly see tonsils here. This is just one of 3 groups of tonsils. This set exists on the lateral sides of your pharynx, and you can see that if people still have their tonsils, you can see that in the back. There's a structure known as the uvula that is part of your swallowing reflex when when food touches that area. And then, of course, the roof of your mouth is the hard palate. And if you go anterior or posterior from there, that's a soft palate, and the uvula is attached to that. So that's what you see in the mouth. After the mouth, when the food, which is present here, I'll just kind of make something there. So when it moves backward, here's the uvula. It's going to go past the uvula, and that food moves into this area known as the pharynx. And the pharynx does have 3 major designations or regions, but here we are in the back of the mouth, so you call it the oropharynx. But this is all your throat. Think of it that way, following the mouth. So the food goes to the pharynx, and then it will go to this structure here, which is the tube behind your windpipe. So that tube is going to be called the esophagus. So define and clarify here. So the pharynx is that space between the mouth and the esophagus. So you swallow the food, it goes into the pharynx, moves to the esophagus, and that's the passageway that then takes the food, the esophagus, to your stomach. So pharynx is going to have both food and air, depending on whether you're breathing or you're swallowing food. It is muscular, so that's important, a muscular tube, and just know the next ending point is that food is going to land in the stomach. So mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach. So let's think for a moment about the swallowing process. We'll keep it simple, but understand there are two phases. You have a voluntary phase where, of course, you're conscious of moving, chewing, moving the food around with your tongue, and then pushing the food to the back of the pharynx. So that's the voluntary phase. Again, you're conscious of that. And then the involuntary phase is really reflexive. All right, so food is in the pharynx and touches the back of the pharynx there and initiates a reflex. And understand, of course, we don't want it to go to the front of the throat, which would be where your trachea is and your larynx, your voice box. So there's a structure known as epiglottis that it's going to fold over, cover the space that goes to your trachea, your windpipe. And now you're just going to swallow and move that food down the esophagus toward the stomach. The process of moving is this movement called peristalsis. And that's the squeezing of these smooth muscles in a rhythmic way that pushes the food downward toward your stomach, and the same kinds of contractions that will push the food all the way through the GI tract. Here you can see the bolus, as we talked about, the food that's been chewed or that you've ingested becomes a food bolus. And here's hard and soft palate. Here's the location of the epiglottis. So that's going to fold over. So you can see here that it's folded over. It's covering your trachea being the anterior front windpipe. And the bolus of food is sent downward down the esophagus. And you can see what is these rhythmic contractions that push the bolus of food. And you will have what are called sphincter muscles. Here, they give it a specific name, lower gastroesophageal sphincter. It actually should have a PH, not SP, SPH, a sphincter. That is a circular muscle, and it has to open up here in order to allow the food in. So when you see sphincter or hear of that, that's going to be a circular guarding muscle that opens and closes to allow something through a passageway. Very quick look at what happens when you have heartburn. So of course, we haven't gotten to the stomach yet, but we know a stomach tends to have an acidic solution. That is by design. The acids in the stomach help us digest protein. But when you have acid reflux, then that has come up into the esophagus. All right, so acid can burn. So that's when you get the burning sensation that we call heartburn. If this is chronic, this abbreviation GERD or GERD is gastroesophageal reflux disease. So this would be a chronic condition that would need to be managed so that you don't have this chronic heartburn feeling. All right, and some suggestions here about how to decrease that incidence of heartburn. And here is a visual of this organ known as the stomach. As I mentioned, often called a J-shaped organ. It's kind of bulbous here at the top and then narrows at the other end where it's going to meet up with the small intestine over here. This is small intestine. So of course the esophagus brings the food to the stomach, sphincter opens, and it lands here. You can see that the interior of the stomach has folds that we call rugae, and these folds can flatten out, right? So it's able to expand and accommodate food, and then it collapses when the food is gone. And again, we'll have more sphincters that helping to regulate the movement of the bolus from one part of the GI tract to another. And in fact, the stomach, because it has a lot of acidic material inside, we're going to see through these gastric pits that the juices of the stomach come up through these openings. And that helps with our digestive functions in the stomach. So to emphasize, again, function of this particular digestive organ, we will, of course, store food, but not for very long. It enters the stomach and leaves within 2 to 6 hours. We will start digestion of proteins. So think of protein digestion starting here, or carbohydrate digestion started in the mouth. And remember, I mentioned this material called chyme. This is going to be the semi-digested material that goes from the stomach to the next location, which is our small intestine. As we look at the further descriptions, we know the layers of the stomach can kind of make it churn a little bit different because there are 3 layers of muscle. The main point is you do get a lot of mechanical digestion, and then you have these folds that allow it to stretch and then collapse again. The gastric juice is going to be low in pH, so it's acidic. And that acidic juice helps to digest proteins. There'll be some specific enzymes. One is called pepsin that helps break down proteins. HCl is acid. It's called hydrochloric acid. And there'll be a lot of mucus because of that acidic solution. The mucus really coats the interior of the stomach. So pH of 2, as you might remember from the chemistry chapter, that's going to be acidic number for pH. And it does help activate the chemicals that are there to help with protein digestion. And one quick aside really is that they have discovered that many gastric ulcers are actually due to the presence of a bacterium. And here's a picture of that. Here we go. Yes, Helicobacter pylori is this cute little green bacterium here. And it seems to be associated with gastric ulcer, which is something that looks like that. Next, we'll move to the intestine. And in this computer animated picture, you're seeing small intestine being all the material, all the passageway that's in the center. Large intestine is out here, which large intestine is also called the colon, right? And for humans, it goes up, over, and down. So small intestine in the center, large intestine or colon going around. And you can see small intestine, in fact, has a small diameter, but it is very long. Large intestine has a larger diameter. The space is bigger, but it's shorter than the small intestine. So as we look at the length, not really that important that you memorize length, but it can be up to 18 feet or 6 meters. We know that there are going to be important enzymes that get to the small intestine, and they come from the pancreas, and they go through small passageways that we call ducts. The pancreas takes those and puts them into the small intestine. In addition, you have besides the enzymes, you have a substance known as bile, and bile is actually made by the liver. It will be secreted by the gallbladder. And from there, it gets into the small intestine. Bile is to help us to break down our fats, to emulsify us, to break them down into smaller pieces. So that's going to happen right here in the small intestine. And then, of course, we talked about the function of the digestive system to absorb materials. It is here in the small intestine that most of absorption happens. It goes through the surface where the interior of the small intestine has these tiny little structures known as villi. They're tiny little finger-like projections and then help us, like a sponge, absorb the nutrients that have been digested into small subunits. And here is a picture of what our interior of the small intestine would look like. And we have folds that are on folds that are on folds. So as you look at one of these here, representing the villi. You have larger folds like this one, and those you can see visually if you had a camera, and then smaller folds on top of those folds. And then inside of that, here's a villus is the finger-like projection. And then you'll have these cells that themselves have tiny little projections called microvilli. And so we can absorb across the wall. The subunits that are being absorbed, you don't need to memorize all of these, but to see as an example, we start with carbohydrates that are bigger molecules. We'll call them, remember, larger complex carbohydrates. They're broken down by enzymes like maltase that breaks down in maltose. And then the glucose is what's absorbed across the tract. All right, so then it goes into your blood. Your proteins, which remember are chains of amino acids, broken down by things called peptidases, because peptides are short chains of amino acids. So now you see the root ACE that tells you, oh, enzyme, maltase, an enzyme, peptidase, an enzyme. And those amino acids move across into your capillary. And then as well, we're looking at the breakdown of fats that have a little more unique process, but you'll have an enzyme called a lipase, again, ACE. It's going to break down lipids. So you've got these fat globules, and here's the example of bile breaking up the fat and then helping that to first migrate into your lymphatic system. And then that then takes it to the capillaries eventually. Here we see highlighted three main accessory organs, larger organs. So the pancreas sitting here like a fish-shaped organ. It's actually hiding really under and behind the stomach. So the stomach's been removed here. You see a small little portion of the small intestine. So you see the relationship of pancreas with small intestine. Here's a gallbladder, and of course the very large liver, which is here. And that's the relationship in terms of position. But let's take a look at what each one of these three accessory organs is all about. As you could see from that picture of the accessory organs, that it's kind of a fish-shaped spongy organ. It's behind the stomach. The stomach was not visible in that picture. But main functions, making some enzymes, really important enzymes, and know the enzymes go to the small intestine. That's really the bottom line. Multiple types of enzymes. So you are digesting all the different organic macromolecules. So then we also have a buffer known as bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a buffer that's coming from the pancreas to the small intestine. Notice it says it's neutralizing stomach acids. And you might remember the role of a buffer is to buffer the pH. And of course, the pH of the stomach is very low. And then finally, there is a hormone that is made, actually a couple hormones made in the pancreas that help keep blood sugar in optimal range. The one you've probably heard of is insulin. And of course, insulin we know has to be released to then take our sugar that we've digested and gets into your bloodstream. That needs to go into cells. So insulin comes from the pancreas and is one of our regulatory hormones helping to keep blood glucose in the optimal range. Next, as we look at the liver and gallbladder, just a few things to highlight. The liver, of course, is very large. It's in the upper right. It's very dark colored, and it lies right underneath the diaphragm, which we know is dividing your thoracic and your abdominal cavities. So diaphragm sits there as a breathing muscle. So your liver is right under it, on the right, more so to the right. And of course, we think of the liver as helping us to detox. So removing poisons and detoxifying as that material comes from the gastrointestinal tract, from your intestinal tract mostly, and then entering circulation. Well, the liver is going to help detoxify those materials. We're also going to gather up iron, important vitamins, and then store them there in the liver. So you've got some storage of nutrients, but also some detoxification. One of the main nutrients as a carbohydrate that's stored in the liver is glycogen. All right, so when we need carbohydrate, the liver has glycogen. So when it says stores glucose as glycogen, glycogen is just many molecules of glucose, remember, put in a large molecule. So that's available from the liver. And then helping with other metabolism, like regulating cholesterol. Without getting into the how it does that, you should also really emphasize that the liver is what makes the bile. It will send it to the gallbladder. So it makes the bile that is then stored or sent to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will release that, really concentrate it, and then release the bile that, remember, helps emulsify fats. So makes bile, sends it to the little gallbladder, that's that green sac, and helps to emulsify fats. And finally, the liver has a role in helping to break down hemoglobin. You might remember from the chapter on blood, hemoglobin is in our red blood cells, carries oxygen, also transports carbon dioxide. So when our red blood cells die, we have to deal with the hemoglobin, and liver will help metabolize that molecule hemoglobin into molecules that can be recycled, or we can get rid of in our urine and in the feces. 2 disorders of the liver that you may have heard of: hepatitis, with that root itis. You know that it means an inflammation, right? We think of increased flow of fluid, swelling. That's hepatitis. There are multiple types of hepatitis, A, B, and C. And there are viruses that trigger this hepatitis, and that can lead to permanent damage and even cancer. So pretty important thing to be aware of. And then cirrhosis is just describing a condition of the liver itself. When the liver has become fatty, eventually it becomes fibrous scar tissue, obviously can't work like a liver. So with cirrhosis of the liver, you can actually physically see on this big brown organ, you see these creamy yellow spots of fat, especially in individuals who have abused alcohol. So you see that with alcoholics and people who have had too much fat circulating. When individuals are obese, you may see cirrhosis of the liver, and that can lead to liver failure. So those are things to be aware of. Next, let's look at the role of the large intestine. The large intestine, as I mentioned, is larger in diameter, right? If you cut it through, you're going to have a larger opening, a space. It is shorter than the small intestine, but larger in diameter, the passageway. Here's where the small intestine is indeed coming up and meeting with the large intestine. So large intestine has some 3 specific areas. Cecum is the beginning, where the small intestine meets the large intestine. Then the colon really is all of this. It goes up and over and back down. That's all colon. And then eventually reaches the rectum and the anal canal. So that's all considered this last part of your digestive tract or your GI tract. The appendix, as most are familiar with, is attached to a portion of the large intestine. So here it is down here. That's the appendix, tiny little finger-like structure. It's kind of like a worm. And in fact, the word for appendix, known as veriform appendix, really means worm-like. And so, of course, that's not something that you have to have. It can be removed if it's inflamed with appendicitis. When we think of the function of the large intestine, it's not so much to take in nutrients as it is to absorb water and help us keep our water so we don't get dehydrated. There will also be present in your gut, in your colon, specific bacteria that help us with the production of the vitamin K and B complex vitamins. And that is because of, as it states here, intestinal flora. Intestinal flora are bacteria. And we know that there are, from your other chapters on the immune system, you know that there are bacteria that live in us and live on us that are friendly bacteria, right? They are good for you. They are helping, in this case, with your metabolism. So these intestinal flora, or certain populations of bacteria in your gut, specifically in the colon, not in the small intestine, in the large intestine, and they help us with digestion. And then finally, the bacteria will also be helping soften the indigestible foods. And then we know that large intestine will then get rid of our undigested material through the feces. And those are the major roles for your large intestine. And a brief look at some of the disorders that are associated with the large intestine or the colon and the rectum. And of course, we're familiar with diarrhea, where you have increased, when we say increased peristalsis, we know that means there's increased movement, right? Increased contractions, pushing material through. And we know the water is not reabsorbed because this material is moving through very quickly. Could be an infection that's triggered diarrhea, could be nervous stimulation that's increasing the contractions, and thus the water not being absorbed. With the constipation, of course, the opposite, in which case the feces are not loose, but they're going to be dry and hard. And that can be controlled by increasing your water intake and your fiber intake. Hemorrhoids being inflamed vessels, they're called hemorrhoidal veins. And when those are inflamed and swollen, that's known as hemorrhoids. Diverticulitis, something that is not as well known, but you have these little pouches within the lining of your intestine, of your colon, and it becomes weak. And those weak spots, or diverticuli, become inflamed and infected. Then the individual has diverticulosis. So that can be very, very painful. IBS, you may have heard of it that way, stands for irritable bowel syndrome. And the muscularis layer just is the smooth muscle of your intestine. So when that contracts powerfully and almost like a spasm without normal coordination of moving the material through the colon, that can then result in chronic diarrhea and a lot of pain. When we consider it inflammatory bowel disease or colitis, this is a chronic situation, IBD or colitis. So then the Crohn's disease would fit into that, which is an autoimmune disease. And then ulcerative colitis just means that the weakness is so great that you end up having breakthroughs or ulcers in the colon. And then finally, polyps and cancer. Polyps are these extra growths that you may see in the wall of the colon. And of course, cancer means that the tissues are growing uncontrollably. So benign polyps can be found. And then of course, you can end up with cancerous growths as well, which would have to be excised and dealt with. And finally, for this chapter 9, part 1, we just want to consider what is obesity and BMI. So as we define these things, BMI standing for body mass index, it's a measure of really the amount of adipose fat tissue relative to your weight. So it's estimated that a BMI greater than or equal to 30 is considered to be grossly overweight, and can then much over that, be classified as obesity. So just a general guide again of how much a person's weight is due to adipose tissues. Remember, adipose is a nice word for fat tissue, which we do need. Of course, we need fat tissue for protection, for insulation, for nutrients, for making hormones that are in the steroid category. So adipose tissue is needed, but we do have to have it in the appropriate amount. BMI that is a measure that does not take into account gender, male, female, fitness level, or bone structure. So it really is a general screening to understand whether or not a person's weight has too much to do with the location of adipose tissue as opposed to bone and muscle. This figure is just kind of an interesting quick graph. As you look at your BMI, you can see that your weight here in pounds and height over here in feet and inches. In the light blue zone, your BMI can be too low. So then the individual's underweight, healthy weight is in the blue, overweight in the yellow, and then considered obese here in the light pink. So finally, really, there's no need to understand, while it's a simple calculation, and you can look it up online if you want to, or in your textbook, you won't need to do any calculations for us on your module tests, but understand that this measure of body mass index, again, more like a screening or a generalization about the range of where the weight is contributed by adipose tissue. All right, that's the end of chapter 9, part 1.